So a very warm welcome to all of you to participate in the first SIDDHAM talk series under the name Dhvani. SIDDHAM, as some of you will already know, is a institute for INDIC and intercultural studies based out of Sarnath, Varanasi. And over the last 3-4 years, we have been doing a lot of seminars and workshops to promote a renaissance of Indic wisdom culture. And our motto, borrowed from Acharya Shantideva, a great Nalanda master, his Bodhisattvacharya Avatara says, Swamano Vasitantu Kritam Mayedam. So what it translates as is, deeds for self-contentment. I think one of the primary purposes or purusharthas in human life is to find a sense of contentment. And we believe that right knowledge and right view can help us achieve that more than anything else. And in this context, we have done workshops of over 50 different scripts. We have organized international seminars, and we continue to create new forms of learning and exchange. And to this effect, we have started what is called as Dhvani. Dhvani, as you know, in Sanskrit means voice. So this is going to be a platform where different voices will resonate and recreate the idea of a renaissance through SIDDHAM. And in our inaugural lecture, we are very happy to welcome Professor Jeffrey D. Long, who is a very distinguished professor. He is a Carl Ziegler Professor of Religion and Philosophy and Asian Studies at Elizabethtown College in Elizabethtown, Pennsylvania. He received his PhD from the University of Chicago Divinity School in the year 2000. He's an author, editor, and co-editor of 11 books, including a very popular book that received an award in 2022 called Hinduism in America, A Convergence of Worlds. He has also received an award from International Ahimsa Foundation and an award for research excellence from Elizabethtown College. He has spoken 3 times at the United Nations and appears in documentaries for PBS and History Channel. So we are very, very happy to have Professor Jeffrey D. Long. I extend a very warm welcome to our distinguished speaker today. And his topic is the urgency of our present moment, Hindu and Jain wisdom for the 21st century. So as we know, we are all moving towards a time which is driven by material culture and lack of awareness of the present moment. Whereas Indian ideas, especially the Hindu Vedic one and the Shramana Jain one, had very profound ideas about what the present moment is and how the present moment, if it expands, it can give you a universal insight into reality. So with these simple words, I welcome Dr. Jeffrey D. Long and all our participants who have come to the inaugural edition of the SIDDHAM talk series. So without much ado, over to you, Dr. Jeffrey Long.
Thank you very much for the very kind welcome. I'm grateful to be part of what you're doing. I really believe very deeply in the principles that SIDDHAM is based on and promoting. So I'm very happy that you've invited me to be part of your program. So if I can share my screen, I've put together a bit of a PowerPoint presentation, which hopefully will help illustrate what I'm talking about today in terms of the urgency of our present moment, Hindu and Jain wisdom for the 21st century. So as Professor Harsha was just saying, the present moment, if you look from the perspective of the Indic traditions, I'm thinking especially of the Buddhist tradition right now, the present moment is all there is, right? The present moment is our reality. And so we need to be attentive to the present moment, and also how this present moment is dependent upon, has been fueled by what we've done in the past, right? There is in all the Indic traditions this concept of karma, right? Of cause and effect. And so our collective actions have led us now to this moment, which is really quite a dramatic one in our history. And so I want to draw attention to some of the danger that humanity and the world as a whole is now facing, and present some ideas that come from these 2 traditions. Of course, there are many, many traditions that have a lot of good wisdom for us to share. I'm speaking today specifically about these 2 Hindu and Jain traditions that I'm very familiar with. to give some indication of how we can draw from these traditions to help us at this time that is so urgent. The picture, if you can all see it, very fairly typical illustration of the climate crisis. We have here a polar bear on a rapidly shrinking ice floe, right? As the ice caps melt, as the oceans rise. This is an illustration in fact, you could have used many different possible pictures here to depict the suffering that's being caused by this climate crisis. So I want to talk about that and what we ought to do in our present moment. Now, this is a very scary picture. And if any of you are familiar with, there was a series, a TV series that was very, very popular based on a book series, very popular a few years ago called Game of Thrones. Some of you might have been fans of it or viewed it. But whether you did or not, I want to use something from that series to characterize our present moment, to provide an analogy for the situation, as I understand it, in which humanity finds itself. Our present moment is comparable to that of the Seven Kingdoms in the popular series Game of Thrones. Again, whether or not you're familiar with the story, in the story, there are these seven kingdoms. They're really all one part of one big kingdom. And there's a war going on, right? The series narrates the conflicts amongst various forces, various parties as they try to gain control of the seven kingdoms. But all the while, far to the north, there's this frightening figure that you can see here. He's called the Night King, and he's tremendously powerful. And his goal is basically to destroy all life on the planet and to bring about a time of darkness and death for all. And the irony is that while this terrible threat is there to the north, the followers, the inhabitants of the seven kingdoms, continue to fight amongst themselves, right? Rather than addressing the larger issue that is threatening all of them, they keep fighting each other. We human beings continue to fight with one another over national, ethnic, and religious identities and various issues that tie to these kinds of tribal issues. Meanwhile, the real enemy, catastrophic climate change looms ever more prominently over our lives. And I think this is more visible in India than in many places of the world, right? The incredible heat of the summer. Summer is always hot, but it's now become unnaturally hot. And the rivers are drying up. So many problems, so many issues are coming from this. And yet we remain primarily focused on fighting with one another rather than addressing this problem that we have collectively helped create, that we need to put all of our ingenuity into resolving. Instead, we're wasting our energy fighting one another. So that's a very grim picture to draw. But I want to say, though, that it's not too late. There is cause for hope. And we have as human beings the resources, the possibilities, right, the knowledge to address this situation and to live in a different way and to do something more constructive. In addition, of course, to our science, our ancient wisdom traditions contain resources essential to the well-being of humanity and of all life on the planet. Today, I'm going to speak of Hindu and Jain resources that are especially relevant to our current situation. Though again, that's not to say that there aren't a lot of resources in other traditions as well that deserve our attention. This is just the focus of my talk today. So one thing that I want to talk about at some length, and this is something that I find present prominently in both Hindu and Jain traditions, is the concept of what we would say in English is pluralism. Pluralism, basically the idea that truth can be found, goodness can be found, beauty can be found in many, many sources, many traditions, not just one, right? Pluralism is a response to what's sometimes called exclusivism. We sometimes hear the idea that only my way of thinking is right, right? Rather it's my religion, my political ideology, whatever it may be. I am right, everyone else is wrong. And this is one of the causes, I would say, one of the underlying behaviors, one of our tendencies that causes a lot of conflict in the world. The solution to that is pluralism. And the picture here is of one of my favorite Western philosophers, Alfred North Whitehead. He has this lovely quote where he says, "Must religion always remain as a synonym for hatred? the great social ideal for religion is that it should be the common basis for the unity of civilization. And by civilization, he's here referring to something global, right? He's not thinking only of Western civilization, Indian civilization, human civilization, right? That's the context of his conversation here. And that there are these wonderful ideas in many, many traditions that we could draw upon and that are really the inheritance of all human beings. And so his hope is that rather than becoming the reason for so much conflict that we see, that religion could in fact be a unifying force. That doesn't mean everyone has to follow the same religion. It means we find shared values in all the traditions that we can uplift and really use to guide our lives and direct us toward a better state of well-being than our present moment. From the Hindu tradition, also from the modern period, we hear a similar sentiment presented a few decades prior to Whitehead by Swami Vivekananda. And this is a very famous quote of his from his welcome address at the Chicago Parliament of World Religions in 1893. Near the end of his address, he says, "Sectarianism, bigotry, and its horrible descendant, fanaticism, have long possessed this beautiful earth. They filled the earth with violence, drenched it often and often with human blood, destroyed civilization, and sent whole nations to despair. Had it not been for these horrible demons, human society would be far more advanced than it is now." I think these are very powerful words by Swami Vivekananda. Swami Vivekananda, of course, came from the Hindu tradition, from the Vedanta tradition, and he really nicely encapsulates in his welcome address some of the core ideas that I want to present today. And here he's talking about the violence, the problems that we have very often associated with religion. But he does not say that religion is the problem. He points to three specific human tendencies: sectarianism, that is our tendency to divide ourselves based on differences; bigotry, the tendency to think that our view, our school of thought is the only one with good qualities, better than all the rest; and fanaticism. Of course, this is when we are so blindly committed to just one very narrow way of thinking that we become filled with hatred for anyone who follows some other path, right? We become highly, highly intolerant. So this is fanaticism. So religion does not have to be accompanied by these three things. It all too often is, but it can also be a source for another way of thinking, which is just the opposite, right? Which is pluralism. And this goes back very, very far. It has very deep roots in Hindu traditions. If you go all the way back to the Rig Veda, thousands of years ago, I'm sure many of you are familiar with this expression, this verse, Ekam Sat Vipra Bahuda Vadanti. That is, reality is one, the wise speak of it in many ways. This verse has been interpreted itself in a variety of ways through the centuries, but Swami Vivekananda and others in the recent tradition have consistently seen this as an affirmation of pluralism, that reality is one. Yes, we're all part of one reality. We all share this world together. We're part of the same cosmos, and there is some ultimate reality to which we're all oriented in various ways, as described in the various traditions. But again, we describe it in various ways, right? We think of it differently. Some people think of a personal God. Some people think of an impersonal set of principles or a force underlying all existence. But the reality we're conceiving of is one. We're seeing it from different perspectives, and so we're describing it differently. But the reality is one. So we don't have to view the views of others as necessarily wrong or something to be feared. They're perspectives from which we might learn, from which we might get a broader view of the reality that we're all perceiving and experiencing. I have another couple of quotes from Hindu sources. The translations here are the ones that Swami Vivekananda himself used in his welcome address. This first one's from a text called the Shiva Mahimna Stotra from the Shaiva tradition of Hinduism. As the different streams having their sources in different places all mingle with their water in the sea, so, O Lord, the different paths which men take through different tendencies, various though they appear, crooked or straight, all lead to thee, right? So this is saying all paths lead to the ultimate goal. They're different paths, they involve different ways of life, different modes of experience, but they're all taking us to our ultimate goal, and therefore they're all to be respected. One is not better than the other. One may be better for you, another may be better for me, but they all take us ultimately to the same place if we practice them sincerely and with the right frame of mind. I will point out that Swami Vivekananda uses this term men and man when he's talking about humanity. We tend to speak more inclusively today. I believe he would have done the same if he were speaking now, but he was speaking in 1893. So I don't think we need to object to that as long as we understand that. The next quote he gives is it's the 11th verse of the 4th chapter of the Bhagavad Gita, also quoted by Swami Vivekananda in his welcome address. The speaker here, of course, is Krishna, saying, "Whosoever comes to me through whatsoever form, I reach him. For all men are struggling through paths which in the end lead to me." Right? So very similar message so we have from his Vaishnava text, the Bhagavad Gita, very similar message to the Shaiva text, right? All these paths are going to the same ultimate place. And we could multiply these quotes, right? There were quotes from Mohandas K. Gandhi. There are more quotes from Swami Vivekananda, other great thinkers, other great scriptures, all affirming this idea of pluralism, right? So it's there, it's present in the world's traditions, but it's something we need to affirm more strongly and make more central, because we fall too easily into this trap of conflict and of identifying otherness necessarily with wrongness, right? We should simply see the other, as different, and as possessing a mode of understanding that we might learn from and benefit from if we were to engage with it deeply. And if we do this sort of mutually respectful dialogue and engage with one another's traditions, seeing all the traditions as resources of wisdom, repositories of wisdom, we would gain greatly, conflict would diminish, and we might find a way out of our current situation. In continuing with the Hindu tradition, Swami Vivekananda's guru, his teacher, Sri Ramakrishna, according to the sources that we have, primary sources about his life, he believed this of himself, right? That he had empirically verified pluralism, that he had actually practiced various traditions, and through them had very profound experiences, realization experiences, what sometimes people today call peak experiences, that for him verified that all these practices had validity. So it's a very powerful testimony to the idea of pluralism. He lived in the 19th century, as we see here, born 18th February 1836, passed away the 16th of August 1886, born in a small village, Kamarpukur, in Bengal, what's today West Bengal. From childhood, he displayed a tendency toward intense trance states, which he interpreted as samadhi, right, which is the highest level of absorption in the Ashtanga Yoga, right, in the 8 stages of yoga described by Patanjali. Skeptics might argue that he was suffering some kind of condition like epilepsy, perhaps. I think these two are not incompatible. It could be that there was something different in Ramakrishna's brain that was making him have these experiences, but that does not invalidate the experiences as sources of knowledge. He found knowledge in them. He found wisdom in them. And this wisdom was so compelling that a very large following developed around him. And so he was not incapacitated by these experiences. His life was enhanced by these experiences. He became a priest of the mother goddess, Ma Kali, at Dakshineshwar at the age of 19. He was basically following in the footsteps of his older brother, who had gotten employment at Dakshineshwar. And so he called on his younger brother, come join me here. And not too long after Sri Ramakrishna and his brother had relocated to Dakshineshwar from Kamarpukur, his brother died suddenly and tragically. And so this was quite devastating to Sri Ramakrishna. And he began to develop a great longing to see God and to know God. And when he talked about seeing God, he was not speaking metaphorically. He really wanted to have an encounter with the divine reality. He thought, I'm here being a priest to this goddess, but what is the point of that if that goddess is not real? If I can't see the goddess, if I can't experience the goddess, then there's no basis for all of this. And so he was filled with intense longing for a vision of the divine reality. And he reached a crisis point in the temple where he was almost ready to take his own life if he didn't have a vision. And he had a vision, and he was overpowered by what he described as waves and waves of light, waves of consciousness surging over him. And he realized that this was the true form of the goddess, different from her iconographic form, right? He described waves and waves of light. And after that, he saw the goddess everywhere and in everything. People thought he'd gone mad. And in fact, one of my favorite incidents from his life, he offered some of the prasad, some of the food offering at the temple that the devotees had brought. He gave it to a cat that was nearby, and the devotees were very offended. But he said, I see my divine mother in this cat as everywhere, so why shouldn't I feed her in the cat? So he was seen as quite eccentric, but people found, nevertheless, something very compelling about him. When he had these visions, he would then start again with another path, another tradition. So he had the vision of the goddess, but then he pursued a variety of sadhanas, a variety of spiritual practices over the course of the next few years. And in each of these, he would practice until he reached the state of samadhi. And he achieved this through diverse means. So again, he concluded from that all of these paths can lead to this goal. So there is, of course, the famous vision of Ma Kali that I just mentioned. This was followed by an encounter with a wandering sadhu who had a little metal statue of the baby Ram, called Ramlal, the boy Ram. And Sri Ramakrishna became so devoted to this image that, at least in his mind, it came to life, right? And he would, play with the little boy. Ramlal would hide from him, and they would have various games. And so this was another one of the forms that his devotion took. He had a very deep devotion to Lord Krishna, and this is a photo of the Murti, the statue of Krishna in the Dakshineshwar temple. And there's an interesting story about this statue. The statue was very beautifully designed. A distinguished artist had put it together. And it was when they were just about to install it in the temple, there was an accident, and the statue was broken. The leg was broken. And of course, according to Hindu tradition, you should not use a broken murti in puja, right, in worship. But this was a nice statue, and they didn't really want to get rid of it. So they asked Sri Ramakrishna, what should we do in this situation, right? At this point, people were seeing him as this very wise person that had a direct encounter with God, and they wanted to know from him what they should do. And he said, should we keep it or should we throw it away? He said, if your brother broke his leg, would you throw him away? So they took that to mean, no, we should keep it. And he actually, besides the other things he's known for, Ramakrishna was also an artist. And he actually repaired the statue, and he did it so beautifully that no one could tell where the crack was. No one could tell where the break had happened. So that statue is still used for puja in the temple to this day. When I visited Dakshineshwar a little over a decade ago, I noticed behind the statue of Lord Krishna, you can see a statue of the Buddha. And he is his hand is in the mudra of touching the earth, right? This is when he calls upon the earth as the witness of his enlightenment. And I was very curious about the statue of the Buddha being here very near the statue of Krishna. And I asked the people who were, who worked there, was there a special significance to it? Was this because Buddha was one of the avatars, or was this some statement about harmony of religions? And I got a very funny answer. They said, no, someone donated the statue and no one knew where to put it, so they put it there. So sometimes these things just happen in a mysterious way that we can't fathom. After the devotion to Lord Krishna, Sri Ramakrishna undertook tantric sadhana. This was under his first guru, who was a woman. She is called in the literature the Bhairavi Brahmani. Scholars believe her actual name was Yogeshwari, and she taught him tantric rituals through which he also attained samadhi. Then a very different teacher. This is a very rare photograph of Totapuri. He was a naked monk in the Advaita Vedanta tradition, and he taught Sri Ramakrishna the path of utter formlessness, Nirguna Brahman. And Ramakrishna had a very powerful samadhi experience through that. In fact, he was in the state of samadhi for several months, and people were worried about whether he would even survive. Someone had to feed him and care for him when he was in that state. Then he undertook a practice of Islam. He put away all his murtis and he prayed like a Muslim, and he quickly attained samadhi in that tradition. And then he also practiced devotion to Jesus and Christianity, and this culminated in another samadhi experience. It actually involved a vision of Jesus, which is narrated in the stories of Ramakrishna's life. So you can look at this in several ways, everything I've just been describing. If we're skeptical, we could say this sounds like a great mythological story, right? That there is this priest who is devoted to God in all the different forms, and lo and behold, all the forms appeared to him, so all paths lead to God, and isn't that wonderful, and so on. We could look at it skeptically, or we could say, look, this was someone who actually lived. We have photographs of him, right? This is not ancient times that we have to speculate about. And we have eyewitness accounts of his behavior, and the way in which he was transformed by his experiences. So what I would suggest is that really we look at this as a very hopeful story, right? That this is an indication, perhaps, of a new way that human beings can relate to religious traditions and think about religious traditions. That Ramakrishna was doing something very radical for the world, saying, look, all of these paths have something good in them. And if you don't believe me, try it, right? This is basically what he was saying, have the experience yourself. And it was revolutionary for much of the world, but if you're familiar with the Indic traditions, in some ways it was really not. It was kind of a restatement of very ancient ideas that we see, again, going all the way back to the Rig Veda. India has long been a place where people have practiced multiple traditions, visited the holy places of multiple traditions, and where there has been a very easy kind of pluralism quite often through history. Of course, we also know there's been communal conflict and great intense conflict in the modern period. I would suggest that historically that's an aberration, that for the most part in the history of India, what we've seen is communal harmony. And that if that could be recaptured, not only for India, but for the world, right, it could become a model for how we could all relate together. And then we'd stop fighting about religion, and then we'd get on with solving things like the climate crisis. So this is my basic thesis today. A very famous quote from Ramakrishna about how he experienced the various paths. He said, I've practiced all religions. He'd practiced religions that were available to him, Hinduism, Islam, Christianity, and I followed the paths of different Hindu sects, and I found it's the same God toward whom all are directing their steps, though along different paths. The substance is one under different names, and everyone is seeking the same substance. Only climate, temperament, and name create differences. Let each man follow his own path. If he sincerely and ardently wishes to know God, peace be unto him, he will surely realize him. Again, saying man and he, I don't think is meant to be exclusive at all. Ramakrishna actually spoke in Bangla, which does not make that gender distinction, actually. So the translation came in the early 20th century, so that was, again, what was used. Another image, and this is going to help us make our transition into the Jain tradition, that Ramakrishna uses for explaining how many paths can lead to God, how many people can see the same reality in different ways, is this very famous story. He says, once some blind men chanced to come upon an elephant, an animal someone told them was an elephant, and they were asked what the elephant was like. The blind men began to feel its body. One of them said the elephant was like a pillar. He had touched only its leg. Another said it was like a winnowing fan. He touched only its ear. In this way, the others, having touched its tail or belly, gave their different versions of the elephant. Just so, a man who's seen only one aspect of God limits God to that alone. It is his conviction that God cannot be anything else. Now, this is actually a very famous story. This is Ramakrishna's version of it. It's been repeated many times throughout the history of India. I did some research, and the earliest version I could find is actually from the Buddhist scriptures, from the Pali scriptures. There's a text called the Udana. And in the Udana, there's a story of a bhikkhu, a monk, who hears a group of monks and priests from various traditions arguing with one another. He becomes very confused. He's not sure what's right and what's wrong. So he goes to the Buddha and he tells him about his confusion. And then the Buddha tells this story. And so it's a response to the idea that, you have a lot of people arguing, everyone saying, I'm right, you're wrong. Maybe everyone is a little bit right and a little bit wrong, right? Maybe we're each getting a piece of the reality through the matrix of the belief system that we apply to it. This particular story has been used a great deal in the Jain tradition to illustrate the concept of anekantavada, which is something I've spent a great deal of time researching. Anekantavada, the anekant in Hindi, anekant means many. Vada or vad in Hindi would mean doctrine or teaching. So this is the teaching of manyness. That is, it's the teaching of the complexity of reality. That reality has many facets. It's not just one thing. Any attempt to reduce reality to just one substance or just one concept is inadequate. Reality is always more than we can conceive. And so this was used, this story of the blind people and the elephant was used as an illustration of how we all are in relation to reality, right? Each blind person could be seen as a different philosophy, a different tradition, a different community, and each one is grasping some aspect of reality, but not the whole of it. And so their disagreements emerge from the incompleteness of each system of thought. So Jain thinkers developed Anekantavada as a methodology for conceptualizing differences across worldviews. What I mean by conceptualizing differences is this. When we come across the fact that other people think differently than we do, we could respond to that in various ways. So we can conceptualize it. We can say, well, they must be wrong and I must be right. Or we can say, well, maybe I'm wrong and maybe they're right. And I have to investigate this further. Or you could be a skeptic and say, well, nobody knows. Nobody knows. Nobody has any idea. That's why we all disagree. But the route that the Jains took was to say that we're all kind of right? We're all grasping different parts of the elephant, so to speak. So according to this approach, there's some truth in all perspectives. And it's been illustrated with this ancient parable. I really like this example, this is much more contemporary, of the same principle of Anekantavada, right? Instead of an elephant, we're looking at the Crab Nebula, right? This is the remnant of a star that died many, many thousands of years ago. In fact, maybe millions and billions of years ago, the light we see from it left thousands of years ago, right? It's a couple thousand light years from Earth. And so the Crab Nebula, these 6 pictures that you see are all of the same nebula, right? They have been taken using different wavelengths of light. So you see a picture taken using radio, using infrared, using visible light, what we see with our eyes, using ultraviolet, using X-rays, using gamma rays. Now they all look quite different from one another, right? There's some similarities. You can see the same shape a bit in the first 4 pictures going from the left. The gamma ray picture looks completely different, right? It really does not resemble the others much at all. Same with the X-ray picture. So I ask my students sometimes when I'm illustrating this point, I say, which of these is the true picture of the Crab Nebula, right? Which one shows us what it really looks like? And of course, the answer is all of them, right? They're all correct. They're all depicting the Crab Nebula through a particular wavelength of light. In another sense, none of them are correct because none of them are all of these things, right? We could try superimposing them upon each other. That might look very strange, but we might have just then created a 7th picture then. It wouldn't necessarily be superior to the others. We need each of these independently to give us insight into different features of this structure in the universe. So I would like to argue by analogy that we similarly need all the world's religions, right? We similarly need science. We similarly need all the various philosophies because they all give us insight into reality. And so we can try combining them, mixing and matching. We can do various things, but we need all of these perspectives ultimately. This gets into really the heart of what I want to say about pluralism, that I believe that this way of thinking is conducive to cooperation across religious communities. If the ideals of Anikantavada and multiple paths to ultimate reality can be promoted widely, it will help mitigate our tribalistic tendency to fear the other. Rather than seeing the other as promoting a false view or even as evil or dangerous, we can see one another's traditions as repositories of wisdom, with some faults and limitations, but also with the core of truth. It also invites us to be critical, right? We want to see truth in all traditions. We also acknowledge that they can't all be true in the same way or in the same sense, right? Some ideas do exclude one another, but we don't have to therefore throw out the whole thing, right? That we can find points of compatibility and we can gain insight. We can find that there are some things that are better known in some traditions than others. Buddhism has emphasized the practice of meditation to a very profound extent, while traditions like Christianity have put a lot of emphasis on organization and community. And so all of these things are important. And so we can really look at them as resources for knowledge that we can gain from, and also leave out those parts which are conducive to conflict or which obscure knowledge. This will facilitate greater cooperation across worldviews, across religious boundaries, as well as between religious and non-religious philosophies. I'm thinking of religion and science, especially, which really don't seem to conflict much at all from the perspective of the Indic traditions, but you see quite a bit of it here in the Western world, conflicts about whether science is compatible with scripture and so on. We want to build bridges across these differences rather than erect walls between them. Shifting gears a little bit, another thing that is very prominent in the Indic traditions is what I'm calling an experiential approach to truth. The Hindu and Jain, as well as the Sikh, Buddhist, Sufi, and esoteric Jewish and Christian traditions, emphasize an experiential approach to truth. Practices like meditation have been developed for transforming consciousness and bringing clarity to the mind. I want to suggest that this can help us not only in understanding the world better, right? If you have a clear mind, a calm mind, you're better able to perceive reality. But these practices have also been demonstrated to give great contentment, great happiness to those of us who practice them. These practices have amazing potential to address the global mental health epidemic, and there is a mental health epidemic. This really came to the fore after the COVID era, but I think it's actually been building for some time, that the very materialistic, narrow and dogmatic ways of thinking that we've generated are they stress us out, right? They prevent us from really experiencing the world in a holistic way. And so these practices really need to be revived. Now, this has been happening. Of course, yoga is tremendously popular. Meditation is becoming increasingly popular around the world. However, it's become all a bit unmoored from its traditional sources. And I want to suggest that there's a lot of insight, there's a lot of wisdom to be found if we go back to the old text, if we go back to the old teachings of how these things developed. There's a lot of insight there that we lose if we just insist on accepting those parts that kind of fit with a very narrow paradigm. So meditation, what is it? Patanjali defined it a long time ago, chitta vritti nirodha, the calming of the modifications of the mind, right? The calming of the waves of the mind. If you think of the mind as a body of water, if you look at a body of water with lots of waves, lots of turbulence, it's difficult to see beneath the surface. It also doesn't reflect the world around it very well, just like the mind. And if we're caught up in very turbulent thoughts and emotions, we are not able to perceive things going on around us clearly, nor do we really get access to ourselves, our true self. But if you calm the waves, if you look at a lake that's very calm, the waves are very still, you can see the surrounding area reflected in it. So yeah, that is the mind seeing the world around it clearly. And you can see beneath the surface. You can see the fish swimming. You can see the pebbles on the bottom. You can, in the same way, when you calm the mind, you can see deeply into self. And if we go back to the old texts, if we go back to the Upanishads, for example, we see the results of explorations of the inner world achieved by people who had cultivated meditation practice to a very high degree. So it's the systematic quieting of the mind, and it's something we all need to do. In fact, I recommend daily meditation. I'm in the Ramakrishna tradition. We meditate twice a day, morning and evening, and the benefits to our lives are simply immeasurable. I won't go into a lot of detail, but I'll briefly share with you something that happened to me 5 years ago, 2019. I went to a conference in San Diego. I got off the airplane, I went to my hotel, then I went out to go attend the conference. And on the way there, I slipped and fell and broke my ankle. And I ended up spending the conference in the hospital. I had to have surgery. I still have a metal rod in my foot to the present day. But I realized something. This happened in 2019. I had been practicing meditation seriously for over 20 years at that point. And if I had had the same mishap much longer ago, right? If it happened when I was in college, for example, I would have been very, very upset. Mentally, I would have been upset. What's going to happen? Will I ever walk normally again? I'm going to miss the conference. How much is this all going to cost? It's painful, etc., etc. But because of my meditation practice, I was able to be very philosophical about it. I said, well, I was in the emergency room, and the doctors and nurses were working on my foot. And one of them, I was chatting with them and joking with them. And one of them said, pardon me for asking this, was one of the doctors. He said, I've been a doctor for many years, but I've never seen anyone who was so obviously in pain, who was so cheerful, right? He said this to me. And I was in pain. My foot was curved, like it was pointed 90 degrees away from the way it's supposed to be pointed. It was a very unpleasant accident. Anyway, I'm fine now. But uh, when he asked me that, I didn't even think about it. Just the words just came out of my mouth. I said, pain is in the body, suffering is in the mind. And he said, oh, that's very profound. And he said, what do you do for a living? And I said, well, I study these traditions. We started talking about Buddhism and Hinduism, and somehow we got onto Zoroastrianism. We had an interesting conversation. But the point is, I was able to use my meditation practice to distance myself from the pain I was feeling in the body. I was able to remind myself that I am not the body. I am not my foot. My foot was in great pain. I imagined that my foot was orbiting another planet around another star many, many light years away. And I was observing it through a telescope, right? It was very far away. So I pushed the pain far away. And then when I saw my foot and saw my body as something separate from me, I also felt compassion for my foot and for my body. I actually apologized to my foot in the hospital. This all sounds very strange, but it got me through this painful experience with peace of mind. And I healed. I went through the whole process of rehabilitation and so on. And just it never disturbed me on a mental level. And if we can endure experiences like that through meditation, I think we can do many, many things with meditation. And of course, the scriptures are full of stories that are much more dramatic than mine, but this was my direct experience, so I can attest to that. Finally, I want to turn to a couple of other lessons from the Jain tradition. Aparigraha, that is non-attachment to material things, literally means non-ownership, but more on a more spiritual and psychological level, it means not being attached to material things, not letting material things be the guiding force in our lives. And of course, ahimsa, nonviolence in thought, word, and action. And this tradition, the Jain tradition, had a tremendous influence on Mahatma Gandhi. He was Hindu, but was very influenced by the Jain tradition. One of his most famous quotes, and it is authentic. It's not one of those made up quotes that you see on the internet. The world has enough for everyone's needs, but not everyone's greed, right? And this was an understanding that he got from the Jain monks and the Jain nuns, the munis and the sadhvis. They live very, very simply. And in fact, they live so simply, I think many of us probably could not survive if we immediately had to live in that way. But I want to connect this with the environmental crisis because, of course, one of the driving forces of the environmental crisis is our consumption as human beings. And in my country, we consume more than most, many more. We have a much bigger carbon footprint, you could say, per person than a country like India. India, on the other hand, has a lot of people. So you also have a larger carbon footprint for that reason. But at the individual level, if we could all adopt some of the practices of the Jain tradition, and this doesn't mean everyone has to become a Jain, but if you look, for example, at vegetarianism, there is so much destruction of the environment that is caused and so much energy that's wasted in the meat industry, right? Meat is this very big industry. Now, I'm not saying everyone has to become a vegetarian, but suppose even if you don't want to be vegetarian, if you eat less meat, right? If you reduce it, if you say, okay, I'm only going to have this amount, or I'm going to have it, maybe there's one day a week I won't have any. I'll be vegetarian one day a week. And as you get used to that, you realize there's some really good vegetarian food out there. You say, well, maybe I'll make it 2 days a week. Maybe I'll make it 3 days a week. All of these practices, if everyone on the planet simultaneously would reduce just a little bit of our consumption, then it would be much, much easier to address this environmental crisis. And we would, in fact, be happier people, because what the Indic traditions tell us is that our true happiness doesn't come from things, doesn't come from the material world. Of course, you need material sustenance, right? There's terrible poverty. People have to have their basic needs met. But that would also be easier if those of us who had more were not consuming so much, right? There would be more for everyone. So this is something that I think we should all become a little bit Jain. And then even a small amount of that would have an enormous impact, I think, on the global situation. So my conclusion, we'll never solve all the world's problems. There are always going to be problems here. But the attempt to do this, the attempt to solve these problems, the attempt to address these problems is itself a type of sadhana. It's a type of spiritual path. Swami Vivekananda called it karma yoga. And of course, I'm sure you all are very familiar with the idea of seva, right? It's a path to the purification of our consciousness. The world, Swamiji said, is a grand moral gymnasium wherein we have all to take exercise so as to become stronger and stronger spiritually. And this exercise he's referring to is our effort to do good, to alleviate poverty, to help the world, to be peacemakers, to make the world more sustainable. He says, putting forth our best efforts without attachment for the results, right? Knowing that we ourselves cannot do it all. This leads us to the highest realization of the perfection of the soul, because we start to put others, we start to put the good of the world ahead of our selfish ego, and that diminishes that ego. That gives that ego less power over us, and the true self can then shine through. So that's the conclusion of my formal presentation. I wanted to leave some time for discussion. But thank you for letting me hold forth about these things that for me are very meaningful and very important. And I'm sure a lot of people here today know much more about some of this than I do, but that's what I have gathered from my years of study and engagement with these traditions. So thank you all.
Thank you so much, sir, for this wonderful session. It was very enlightening. So floor is open for the questions. If anyone wish to ask, you may please. Anyone?
I always say if there are no questions, that's either very good or very bad. It either means I explained everything, or it means that it's so confusing, no one knows where to start.
No, sir. It was very enlightening. I took up a lot of notes for that. I want to ask question.
Please.
Your aim was with regard to religious pluralism or a political theory in that social agenda?
Sorry, I think
I'm saying the concept of pluralism you were trying to put on was basically a religious pluralism you were pointing out, or a political theory framework for the society?
Okay, very good question. Very good question. I would say it is primarily a religious construct, but it does have political implications, meaning that if I like to focus on the level of the individual person, because I think, like many of us, I look at the magnitude of the world's problems and society's problems, and I think, what can I do? I can do nothing. I'm just one person, right? But I can change my own life. I can change, like, if I see there's a lot of conflict in society, I can't solve that conflict, but I can say, okay, I'm not going to participate in conflict. I'm going to respond differently if I disagree with someone. I'm going to create some positive space in my own life. So my sense is, maybe it's kind of a naive sense, but is that if enough people did this on the individual level, it would begin to affect the whole society, right? Because we would, for example, in my country now, I think, and I think this is true in India also. I remember one year I was visiting in India, and this has now been the case for over a decade, but this was the first time I had seen it. I was watching a news program in India, and there were the faces of 10 people on the screen, and they were all shouting at each other at the same time, and you had no idea what anyone was saying, and they're all very angry and very passionate. And I just thought, wow, that's something we've exported from America, and it's one of our worst things. This type of sensationalistic conversation where we say something as controversial and as upsetting as we can to get attention, and what happens is that succeeds because people are attracted to it. Right? People rise to the bait. They're like, "Oh, this is interesting. What is this guy saying?" And then people get very angry, and so. But it has really bad effects on society, right? I mean, actual violence emerges from these kinds of conflicts. So we need to have a lot more of a. We have to find a way to promote and really attract people to this idea of a very serene, very calm, very rational way of thinking and speaking. And I think this will then overflow into the political arena. I think if we tried to legislate this, it would not work, right? If you bans like, okay, we're not going to allow anyone to say anything controversial about another religion. Well, as soon as you ban something, the first thing people want to do is do that thing, right? They want you. This is in the biblical tradition also. You know, God puts the tree in the garden and says, you don't eat from the fruit of that tree. So the first thing that the first human beings want to do is go eat the fruit, right? So I don't think we can ban it. I think we have to be good examples and good models of the world we want to live in. That's how I tend to think of it. And that's why I sort of don't get into politics very much, because inevitably it devolves into that kind of debate. So I see some very good comments. There's a question in the chat. I can go ahead and take if that's all right. Sharad Chandra says, according to Jain philosophy, introduction of Syadvada. So Syadvada is connected with Anikantavada, right? So if there are actually three doctrines, Anikantavada, Nyayavada, and Syadvada. And they are interrelated. Anikantavada is what we would call in the world of philosophy an ontology. Yeah, it's a manifold truth. And then there's Nyayavada, which is epistemology. That's the theory of knowledge. If there are many facets of reality, as Anikantavada teaches, that means there are correspondingly many perspectives from which it can be viewed, right? These are called the Nyayas in Sanskrit, in the Jain philosophy. And then if those two are the case, how should we speak to one another? How should we affirm and make truth claims? And we should make our claims conditional, right? Which is what Syat. Syat has a very technical meaning in Jain philosophy. It means from a certain perspective or in a certain sense or from a certain point of view. Right? And so instead of making claims in an absolute way, right, everybody must do this, for example, they say, well, from my perspective, as I understand it, this is what we should do, right? It's a much more humble way of speaking. And modern Jains have begun to refer to this as intellectual ahimsa, which some scholars have critiqued because it's not really the way the ancient philosophers used it. But I think this modern Jain way of thinking of it is very hopeful and helpful. So that, you know, if you have a, you know, there's a great Indian philosopher, B.K. Maltilal, Bhima Krishna Maltilal. My first introduction to Jain philosophy was through his book on Anikantavada, and he said if you add Syat to any sentence that you say, you have spoken the truth because you've qualified it. And so yeah, so Syadvada is a further implication of Anikantavada. I appreciate nice comments.
Where do you put the idea of God in this whole philosophy?
I'm sorry, what?
So where do you put the idea of God in this principle of pluralism and its whole reality?
Okay, no, this is excellent. This is the most important question, I think, one of the most important questions. Where do we put the idea of God? Because there are people who say God is real, God exists. That's the most important thing. The other people say no, there's no evidence for that. You don't need that idea. The Jains and the Buddhists don't have a sort of creator God, right? There's spirituality, but there's not a personal God. So if you take the Syadvada approach, you would have to say, well, in some sense there is God, and in some sense there is not God. And what I take that to mean is that there is this reality that many people have experienced, like Ramakrishna, like the great Bhakta saints of the Vaishnava and Shaiva and Shakta traditions, the Christian tradition. You know, they've had this experience of the loving presence of this reality. But what a lot of the mystics and the deeper practitioners of these traditions will also tell you is that ultimately God is unknowable, right? You can know that aspect that you experience, but when you're talking about something that is infinite, it's really beyond what we can conceive. And so arguably the most true thing you could say about God would just be silence, right? It would be which is not a denial of the idea of God, but it's also refraining from affirming very strongly any one view that's going to limit the idea of God. So this is my understanding of Buddhism, actually. It was not so much a denial of a divinity as a refusal to play that game. It's like, well, if I define God like this, someone else is going to define God differently, and then we fight. So Buddha said, okay, we don't want that. So no views about God are going to be expressed. So I would say, yeah, that's how I would say it. There is, in a sense, God. There is, in a sense, not God. And in the Gita too, Krishna says that most of his reality is unmanifest. Right? It's utterly beyond our ability to comprehend. So about that, we really can't say anything. So that's the way I would take it. So that we should make all statements about God with humility. That's what I would offer. I guess the last thing I would add on that, there's a wonderful quote from Swami Vivekananda where he says, God does not exist. God is existence itself. Right? So you have kind of an understanding of God as not a being like us, but a kind of foundational reality that underlies everything. Okay. I see another question here. Let's see. So all schools of thought teach to be calm and tolerant. Can you put some light on Dvaita and Advaita philosophy relating to pluralism of religion? So this is very closely connected with the question about God, right? Because the core disagreement between Dvaita and Advaita, right? Dvaita, dualism, there is God and there is us, and we are distinct, right? That's how the relationship of bhakti can occur, because we are distinct. In Advaita, no distinction, all is one, all is Brahman. There's really no distinction. So on the surface, these two are contradicting each other. And many great thinkers in both traditions, people far smarter than me, have argued against the other position and tried to refute it, and so on. If we step back from that, what we often see, I actually had a wonderful conversation with the great bhakti saint, living saint. I won't name him, but he said this to me. He said, when you look at the most advanced souls in these traditions, they're not arguing and debating with one another, right? That level of arguing and debating is a kind of preliminary level of spiritual life. But what's important is to commit to one particular view and then live based on that. Do your sadhana based on that. So if you're a bhakta, be a bhakta and live like that. And if you're an Advaitin by instinct, if you feel very drawn to and very comforted by that idea, follow that idea. Sri Ramakrishna says they both lead to the ultimate goal. And in fact, that's what the Gita itself says. Now, people have taken this verse in different directions, but when Arjuna asks Krishna, which is better, to be a bhakta or a jnani, he says it's more difficult to be a jnani, but both reach me in the end, right? And so I think these are both alternate views of understanding reality. They have strengths, each of them, but they also have areas where they break down. But they can each function to be the foundation of a practice that will have it lead to a transformative experience. So that's how I understand it. And another thought about that I want to share is that I've known people who were very, very serious Advaitins and very, very serious Bhaktas, very serious Dvaitins. And I find that they're more alike than they are different. That the Advaitins I know are very devoted, and the Bhaktas I know are very rational and can, analyze and break things down just like in the Jnana Yoga tradition. So I think these are both different ways of cultivating an experience of divinity, which for some is dual, for some is non-dual. But again, those are just both ways of trying to explain something that finally defies explanation. Sharad Chandra says, please describe Saptabhanginaya. So Saptabhanginaya is that's the sevenfold or seven-limbed perspective. That's Syadvada in a nutshell, right? According to Syadvada, again, every statement we make, we should qualify. We should say it's true from a certain perspective. And according to the idea of Saptabhanginaya, there are seven possible levels of truth, or truth values, we would call them in philosophy. So a claim is true from a certain perspective. It's false from a certain perspective. That's the second perspective. It's both true and false from a third perspective, if you combine the first two. It's indescribable from a fourth perspective. I think this corresponds a little bit to the Buddhist. It is something that both neither is nor is not, right? It literally cannot be comprehended by logic. And then you have three non-redundant combinations of the first four. So something is true and indescribable, false and indescribable, and true and false and indescribable. And if you keep adding more, they become redundant. So 7 is the number that the Jains came up with. When people use the expression, there are two sides to every issue, I always like to say there's 7. There's 7 sides to every issue, because you have all the different possibilities in the Saptabhangi. Someone said, can you put some light on Vishishtadvaita philosophy and Sankhya philosophy relating to pluralism? Okay, I'm happy to do that, but this is going to become a very long lecture, I think, because there's a lot of detail to go into there. But what I would briefly say about Vishishtadvaita, some have pointed to a lot of commonalities between Ramakrishna's teaching and Vishishtadvaita, because Vishishtadvaita is, in one sense, Advaita, and in one sense, Dvaita, right? It is saying that distinctions are real, and yet there is a larger oneness in which everything participates. I think that's fundamentally true, and I think that's very compatible with pluralism, because within Vishishtadvaita, if you're emphasizing the oneness, you're more on the Advaita side. If you're emphasizing the distinctions within the oneness, you're more on the Dvaita side. That's a very brief way of saying it. You could write a whole book on that topic, but I just wanted to respond to the question. And Sankhya, I think Sankhya has a very important role to play in understanding Indian philosophy. It's one of the oldest schools of thought, and I can see a lot of affinities. Of course, Sankhya, a lot of it was picked up by Vedanta. And of course, the Sankhya and the Jain traditions are very similar in many respects. What I find that Sankhya, in relation to pluralism, where it's very interesting, is it reminds me of my experience with with breaking my ankle, right? The Purusha is not Prakriti. The Purusha is something utterly distinct from this world and its experiences. And so, viewed from that perspective, I think it provides a basis for great comfort in face of tragedy, in the face of death and pain and suffering. Say, I am not this, right? I am not this. I am that, right? And so, in terms of pluralism, I think if you take that perspective, then anything that is conducive to that understanding is something that you want to accept and affirm, right? Even if it's from a different tradition or a different understanding. Someone says, can Hindu and Jainism be a solution of environmental change and nations' war in the modern world? So I think they can contribute in a positive way to both of those problems. The war and conflict aspect, I think if we were more pluralistic in our thinking, we would lean more toward negotiated solutions rather than violent conflict. And I think if we pulled away from our materialistic, consumeristic ways, kind of like, I mean, the Jain monks, of course, take it to the ultimate limit. But if we incorporated a little of that in our lives, I think it would mitigate the environmental problem. Probably wouldn't solve it, but it would make it better, right? Harsha says, any philosophy that recognizes the importance of interdependence of humanity to nature and natural process to human nature can bring meaningful solutions. I fully agree with that. Whether that's a religious philosophy, a secular philosophy, Indic philosophy, Western philosophy, Chinese philosophy, we find this thread in all of them, that we're all interdependent, we're part of one organism. We need to live accordingly, right? We need to live in light of that insight. What is sectarianism? The definition of sectarianism, as I understand it, is the tendency to split up into smaller groups because you're looking for ideological purity, right? So my understanding of the religion is better than yours. So those people are bad because they think of it differently. So pretty quickly after a religion comes into being, then you get it splitting up into different groups. And sometimes the conflicts between those groups are more intense than between different religions, right? If you think of Protestants and Catholics, right, they're both Christians, but they have fought intensely through the centuries. Shia and Sunni Muslims, they both follow Islam, but they've been at odds for such a long time. What is Shunyavada philosophy? So that is a form of Buddhist philosophy attributed to the sage Nagarjuna. And it really, at its core, teaches what Harsha said, that everything is interdependent, right? The late Thich Nhat Hanh, great Vietnamese Buddhist master, coined the term interbeing to describe this, right? That shunya means emptiness, but that means empty of some kind of independent self that would not be part of the larger network of being. We're all part of that network of being. Describe the differences between non-dual philosophy, qualified monism, and dualism. Okay, so this has become a course in Indian philosophy, but very briefly. So the non-dual philosophy teaches Brahman alone is real, nothing else exists, right? Qualified monism says Brahman is real, Brahman alone is real, but within Brahman there is difference. So there is a world, there are jivas, there is Ishvara, and these exist within the larger unity of Brahman. Dualism emphasizes distinction. There is Ishvara, there is us, we're not the same, right? So that's the difference. Swami Vivekananda tended to see these as sort of steps. He saw them as leading from dualism to qualified monism to monism. But of course, I've seen dualist philosophers do just the opposite. So this is an ongoing debate within Indian philosophy. Prabhu Narayan Soni said, sir, as you said, almost all religions are moving toward the same truth through different paths. Then why are they determined to prove themselves better than others? Fantastic question. I think it is because if we think of religions, the ways of life, the rituals, the practices, the beliefs, they are strategies, they are plans, they are recipes, you could say, for guiding their practitioners to a higher realization. But prior to reaching that higher realization, when they're the way they're taught very often to the younger generation, it's just a set of rules. You do this, don't do that. What's the reason? Well, because we said so. That's the way we've always done it. And so people begin to identify their family, their community with that set of practices and rules. And so anything that criticizes that or differs from that, they take as a personal affront. They feel hurt by that. So it becomes a matter of tribal identity, which actually completely ignores what the real practice is about. Swami Prabhavananda has a beautiful image for this. He says that if we got the founders of these great traditions together in a room, they would embrace. If we brought their followers together, they would kill each other, right? So they're saying, rather than live like Jesus, let's go fight people in the name of Jesus, right? Rather than live like the Buddha, let's go fight people in the name of the Buddha. Jesus and Buddha were not about fighting, right? So, yeah.
If I can add one thing, Professor Jeffrey Long, it was a very wonderful lecture. And what has been very inspiring is that you emphasized the need for personal experience by quoting the life story of Sri Ramakrishna Paramahamsa and even the Keval Jnana of the Anekantwada. So I think the purpose of all these traditions and ideas is to seek inspiration to go on a personal inquiry. And when the realization of what you are trying to see kind of matches that, then you will understand. Otherwise, we are dealing with words. And I come from the tradition of Nagarjuna. Somebody asked about Shunyata and Vaibhashika, Swatantrika and all that. So Nagarjuna says that no one has reached the ultimate nature of things through words, and the symbols. So the idea is you take inspiration from the words of sages and scriptures, but you set off on a personal journey of inquiry and realization. And when you put that to practice, the story becomes your own. Like what Professor spoke of about his, ankle injury and that, metal rod, and how in this time of great pain and personal discomfort, he was able to detach from his bodily sensation and go back to a deeper aspect of the mind. I think that is essentially what philosophy teaches us, because there's a love for knowledge, because you can endure the suffering of samsara or transcend it, if you're a good practitioner. So I think today, the urgency of the present moment and the Hindu Jain wisdom for 21st century, it's a very wonderful starting this thing for us. It is the first of the many Dhvanis to come. And I hope that this echoes and resonates deeply with all our participants. And we look forward to more of such in the future. So we thank Professor Jeffrey Long for this wonderful talk. And we hope that you can participate with us in one of our future programs also. Thank you so much for your vast learning, scholarship, and kind and compassionate worldview. Because the beauty about all this learning is that you should be able to engage. We should be able to engage with the world in a more kinder and a very, understanding way. So I think your presentation was very much about that. And I like how you juxtaposed two different approaches of Keval Jnana and Anekantvada, with the classical illustration of the elephants and, the blind people touching that, and then the nebula and the different images of nebula to X-ray and electron microscope and gamma ray, this thing. I think each one corresponds to our level of perception, and as we kind of refine our level of perception, we can have differing understanding, and ultimately all of them dissolves or joins into whatever, the great light, or collapses into emptiness or whatever. But I think that willingness to be able to look at all these things is the purpose, and we are very, very happy to have such a learned scholar and an eminent speaker to be a part of our small and humble effort. So thank you so much, Professor Jeffrey Long. We really enjoy, and I'll be personally in touch with you, and I look forward to accessing some of your work on PBS and History Channel too. Thank you so much. Namaste.
Thank you very, very much. Namaste. Thank you.
Namaste.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, sir. We will reach to the conclusion. It was a very enlightening session. So in the end, I would like to extend my heartfelt greetings to our General Secretary, Dr. Anirban Das, Program Director, Dr. Vibha Pandey, and all the committee members of our this institute, and all the participants for participating with zeal and enthusiasm and joining us today. Thank you so much. And thank you so much, sir, for such a wonderful session. It was very enlightening, and we look forward for convening more sessions with you. Thank you so much, sir.
Thank you. Thank you for your warm welcome, and everyone have a wonderful evening.
Thank you so much.